I want to thank everyone for logging on and being part of this session today. Before we get started, I will, of course, start with a land acknowledgement that I want to thank Jude for and Professor of the University of Windsor. People of African descent, we offer this land recognition and solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island in the efforts and deliberate intentions towards decolonization. Acknowledge that the land of Turtle Island that was never meant to be owned. We recognize that most of the land that was entrusted to the Indigenous peoples was in some cases shared by choice, but all too often taken by force. Recognize the historical colonialism and the ongoing colonialism that has led to the present day situation where land acknowledgements are offered in the place of land. People of African descent, many of us have come here by choice, while many are here as a result of historical force. Acknowledge the complexities. We're promised land that was never given by those who it was never was to give. People of African descent, we acknowledge the land of Turtle Island that sustains us, expresses deep gratitude to its Indigenous peoples, and pledge to honor our dignity and divinity that ultimately connects us all. Thank you. And I'm going to give a little bit of a background on my friend Jude here, without making him probably a little humble and embarrassed and shy, but I'm sure he's used to it. So right now, Jude Gerrard is the ombudsperson at NASCAT, and this is the new role for him, but well deserving. And a little bit of background about Jude is Jude was born in Sheet Harbor and is a member of the Millbrook First Nation. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree from St. Mary's, a Bachelor of Education from Acadia University, and is in the process right now of completing his Master of Education in Equity and Social Justice degree at Acadia. He's worked for several different federal departments, including the RCMP, Correctional Services Canada, and Veterans Affairs. He's also worked for many departments within the Nova Scotia Public Service in education and early childhood. He also, I'd say, worked with me, one of my colleagues in the Office of Equity and Anti-Racism Initiatives, where he helped draft Canada's first equity and anti-racism legislation about dismantling hate and racism. Jude has worked at a number of post-secondary institutions, and most recently has received his Certified Diversity Executive designation from the Institute of Diversity in Annapolis, Indiana, and was the first Mi'kmaq employee to be awarded the Nova Scotia Premier's Award of Excellence. And so it was my great privilege and honor to introduce my friend, my colleague and co-worker in all sorts of forms, Mr. Jude Gerrard. So, thank you.
Thanks, Angela. First, I just want to say thank you all very much for having me in today. Before I get started into the presentation and what it is I wanted to talk about, I always like to sort of highlight my casual attire whenever I'm doing professional development. So back in February of 2012, I started wearing hoodies whenever I do professional development, and it's sort of my silent standing in solidarity with the killing of Trayvon Martin, who was wearing a gray hoodie on the evening he was killed for carrying a can of iced tea and a bag of Skittles. So it's sort of my way of standing. It's my silent protest to police brutality that's happening in the United States and Canada. Down in the United States, to folks of African descent, and equally as important is the violence against Indigenous people here in Canada at the hands of police across this country. I think of some of the most current cases around, here in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but more specifically Colton Boushie in Saskatchewan, and Stonechild, who became a victim of the Starlight Tours in Saskatoon in the middle of winter. I guess what I'm here today to talk about is reconciliation. One of the things that I've noticed and I've heard from folks since 2015 is how do we do this, and what does it mean to me personally? I think it's quite easy for us to find our way through reconciliation when it comes to our work lives, because it's pretty well laid out in the 94 calls to action. But what does that mean to us as Canadian citizens? What does that mean to us as individuals in our social lives, in our personal lives, and in our family lives? What does reconciliation look like from there? So what I've done is I've actually created a presentation where I've taken the 94 calls to action and I've broken them down into 4 key pillars. And I think when we group them like that and we start having conversations around what that means, it makes it a little bit easier to see what reconciliation looks like in our own personal lives. So I'm going to try to get my presentation going here. I do have my sound enabled, just in case I'm able to share a video towards the end. I don't know if it's going to work or not. If it doesn't work, I've made a commitment. I'll drop it in the chat, a link to it so folks can watch it afterwards. So just bear with me here for a moment while I try to get this going. Let's see. There we go. I think it's loading now. There should be a title slide up there. Can somebody just let me know if you see it?
See it.
Okay, awesome. So one of the things that I really like to start with is just asking this question about reconciliation, because I'm always curious with groups that I talk to find out what they think reconciliation is. So I always like to ask, what does, when I think about reconciliation, what does it mean to you, and what does it look like? What does it feel like? So I know folks have their mics turned off right now, but I would ask you to please feel free to turn them on, because I'd like to hear from you what reconciliation is to you. What does it mean? What does it feel like? And what does it look like? So please feel free to shout a few words, and I'm just going to take a couple jot notes down here as you go. So please, I'm going to leave it open to you for a couple seconds here.
Hi, Jude. It's Sherry in the St. John's office. For me,
Hey.
It means making sure that I do the work to understand the history of interaction with Indigenous peoples in Canada. I have a decent knowledge of it in Atlantic Canada, but I'm always shocked when I attend some of these as to what I hear happen, particularly out in the prairies and west.
Oh, listen, I lived out there for many years. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, so it's just having a better understanding of the, I guess, atrocities of the past to make sure that it properly colors my outlook on the present so that we can do a better job of the relationship with Indigenous peoples in the future, so that we don't continue to cause generational harms that have been caused in the past by continuing to be misinformed by the past and the rhetoric from government in the past.
Right on. Thank you very much. So understanding that past to work towards a better future. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Anybody else? I should let you know that I used to teach grade 2 and grade 3, so I can sit around and wait all day for folks to talk. So a couple more people, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Jude. It's Andrea again. I guess for me, it's about learning. So I was going to express that as well, and thank you, Sherry, for articulating that. It's learning the history and the distinct history, because it is different. And I learned that through a presentation we received from one of the friendship centers in Newfoundland. That the history obviously is very different in Newfoundland as it is for other Atlantic provinces, and also even the apology and its applicability and sort of a lot of really important things about the trajectory of reconciliation in Canada in each different province. But it's also about acknowledging the privilege that I hold as a white woman as a result of colonialism, and sort of actively trying to challenge that and effectively, I guess, reconcile that in an active way.
Right on. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Anybody else?
Hi, it's Barb.
Hey, Barb.
To me, it's maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. in our country.
Mutually respectful. Awesome.
Relationship. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. One more person and we'll move on. All right, so I've got this little rule that I wait for 5 seconds, and if nobody has anything to say, it's time to move on. I appreciate that. So some of the things that I hear when I ask this question to different groups and organizations is exactly what you're saying here, you know, acknowledging that privilege, which is actually a really interesting one. That's the first time that's actually been brought up when I asked that question. And I think that's a really important piece for us to recognize, because until we can move forward in this relationship, we actually have to acknowledge and recognize that 100% of the intergenerational wealth in this country comes directly from the backs of colonialism and enslavement. So until we can recognize that, it makes it really difficult to move forward. Some of the other things that I hear, it's about rebuilding relationships, healing, and moving forward, mending broken partnerships. I find that quite interesting, because what that actually means is that there was a good relationship and something happened to break it, and now we're finding ways to make it better again. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if the relationship was never good to start with, is it truly reconciliation? Because we have to be totally honest about it when we're talking about these conversations. There never was a good relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. So we can't really say that it's reconciliation, because we're not trying to reconcile something. One of the things that I've heard an elder say several months ago is that we're not talking about reconciliation. What we're talking about is conciliation, about building a relationship to move forward. So those are some of the things that I really like to think about. And the one thing that folks don't generally recognize when it comes to reconciliation in the TRC is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they started off with their own definition of reconciliation. And it's quite different from this Western ideology that we have when we think of reconciliation, when we think about healing those past relationships and that sort of stuff. So what they actually stated was reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And in order for that to happen, there has to be an awareness of the past. There has to be an acknowledgement of the harm that's been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to actually change behavior. So they started off not with this idea of we had a great relationship, it broke, and we have to move forward. They actually started off with reconciliation being about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship. So as the TRC was going around, they realized that relationship was never good to start with. So they needed a different stance, a different starting point towards this relationship. One of the people that I quote a lot is the former Senator Murray Sinclair, one of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And one of the quotes that he said during the TRC, we should never forget it's part of who we are as a nation, and this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people. I would challenge that, and I would move it a little bit deeper to have that same. We should never forget it's part of who we are as a nation, and this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable children. We sort of take that children piece out of it because it makes it a little easier for us to talk about, right? But let's face it, the Indian residential school system wasn't taking adults; they were taking our children away from us. So when we think about reconciliation, I actually stopped using the term reconciliation probably. I think it was about 2 months maybe after the calls to action were released. I was doing an evening event on the Grand Parade. It was actually New Year's Eve, and we were down on Grand Parade, and I was doing an opening smudge and the honor song, And I started talking about ReconciliAction at that point, because it is about the actions that we actually do, right? When we think about it, reconciliation or ReconciliAction is the intentional actions we take personally, as institutions, and as a society to build a relationship where we work to remove systemic oppression, intentional barriers and inequities that have been created, and recognize inherent and treaty rights, as well as treaty responsibilities. So when we think about these barriers and inequities, we have to recognize where they come from and where they stem from. And I appreciate whoever it was earlier talking about, acknowledging privilege as a white, and I would add cisgendered person. I'm just going to add that in there because I can't see anybody and I don't know anyone. But generally speaking, and recognizing that these barriers and equities are intentionally put in place. They might seem as just pieces that are there, but those are barriers that were put in place to elevate some and keep others down, right? And they all come from this ideology of white supremacy within our systems, because that's what our society is actually built on in North America. We can sit here and we can argue until we're blue in the face, but when it boils down to the barriers and equities, that's exactly where they come from. And then the other piece around inherent treaty rights, it's a really interesting discussion for us to continue to have, because when we talk about treaties, we have to understand that as Mi'kmaq people, we didn't sign the treaties with ourselves. They were signed between two parties, right? So you can't have a treaty with yourself. It has to be between two groups. And so with that, it makes us all treaty people here in Nova Scotia. But what's happened over the several hundred years since the treaties were signed is that the treaty rights were oppressed, and treaty obligations and responsibilities were ignored. So we have to continue to have these conversations on what it means to be a treaty person here in Nova Scotia in order to move this relationship forward. So when we think about the legacy of Canada's Indian residential schools, I think one of the things that we have to talk about is this the way we discuss the residential schools here. Many of us refer to them as Canada's residential schools. But we have to remember that Indian is the only legal definition we have to describe ourselves as based in the Indian Act. So I think it's really important for us when we're talking about these schools to refer to them exactly what they were, Indian residential schools. We hear time and time again that that's language we shouldn't use. However, that is the language that we should use when we're talking about these schools, because they were specifically designed for one group of people, right? So overall, through the history of the Indian residential school system in Canada, the odds of dying for children in these schools was 1 in 25. The odds for Canadians dying serving in World War II was actually 1 in 26. So this in itself shows that Canada was at war with its most vulnerable citizens. The odds of a child dying in the Indian residential school system when it first started in the early years, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was actually 1 in 2. So 50% of all children who attended Indian residential schools in the early days of this system never made it home. And right now, today, there's approximately 80,000 survivors still living in Canada that attended one of these schools. And, when we think about it, when it comes to Indian residential schools, they are the only schools that refer to that we refer to the graduates as survivors. It doesn't happen anywhere else. So that kind of says something within itself to what these schools were really about. So when we think about it and what we've seen happening over the last several years since COVID, we've seen a lot of conversations around unmarked graves being discovered around these sites across Canada. And we know right now that of all the sites that have been found through LIDAR, ground penetrating radar, they found anomalies in the soil. But these anomalies aren't, we don't know what's there, I guess is the best way to put it. And one of the things that's been going around social media over the last several months is this idea and this ideology that Canada has fallen for a hoax. That there are no bodies at these schools. We've got documented proof that there are in grave sites. These pieces that have been found over the last little bit, we have to remember that our communities have been saying that these are possible burial sites. The media itself has been saying that they're burial sites. Our communities have been saying all along that these are possible burial sites that have been identified across the country. And there has been, so far, I believe there's only been 2 schools that have actually been physically searched in certain areas, and there haven't been any bodies found. But we've got to remember that's only 2 schools, right? And we've got 130 some others that we have to search before we can actually state that. One of the things that I found really interesting and disturbing at the same time when we look at Indian residential schools across the country is actually this map here. So each one of these dots, I know it's a little hard to see, but each one of these dots represents one of the Indian residential schools across Canada. And when I started looking and digging into these, I actually found something quite interesting. And if you watch this blue line up here across this map, you'll notice that it sort of follows where these schools are across the country. This is actually the railway being built, moving west so that we can settle the western part of our country. And as the railway was moving through, more and more of these Indian residential schools were popping up, out of sight, out of mind. It was a way to remove cultures and remove families from the area so that the rest of Canada could continue to expand west. It's one of those things where we've always sort of been pushed out of sight, out of mind. I was talking to Angela a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things I've done is I've actually taken a map of Nova Scotia, and I've taken the Mi'kmaq communities here in our province. You know, we always make that assumption that there's 13 Mi'kmaq communities, but there's actually 44 because there's smaller pieces of land where there's only a few people living on, or maybe nobody living on at the time. But I've taken this map and I've overlaid the Mi'kmaq communities with the historic Black communities. And one thing that I've noticed is that we're side by side. What's happened across our province is the exact same thing that's happened across Canada. We've been pushed to the barriers, out of sight, out of mind, right? And Angela, I did find that map, so I do have a copy of it for you, so I'll get that to you later. But I just found it really interesting to actually notice and recognize that when we talk about Indian residential schools, you know, the government always had this policy of educating Indigenous children through this system, but this had absolutely nothing to do with education. As we can see from this map, it was a way of removing groups from their traditional territories so that others could take over the land. So when we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was a number of things that happened with that commission. So the TRC was just one component of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And that a lot of folks don't realize that settlement itself really got its start here in Nova Scotia, actually in my home community of Millbrook. There's a former survivor and victim of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School who lived in my community a few years back. Her name was Nora Bernard. And what she did was she actually started bringing survivors together so that they could sort of counsel each other and help each other, you know, just almost like in talking circles, just so that they could hear each other's stories and comfort each other and help each other work through the trauma. And this ended up getting a little bit bigger, and then other communities started doing the same thing. And it was her direct involvement in helping other survivors that the lawsuit was actually filed. And as we all know, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement came out of that. And one of the things that came out of it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And they were mandated to document the truth of survivors and families, communities, and anyone else personally affected by the Indian residential school experience. And this in itself included First Nations, Inuit and Métis former Indian residential school students, their families, communities, the churches, former school employees, the government, and other Canadians as well, who were affected and impacted by the Indian residential schools themselves. So the thing we need to remember, and I think it's important for all Canadians to remember, because it speaks to the power of the movement that happened with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC itself was not a criminal tribunal, and the commissioners of the TRC, they had absolutely no subpoena powers. So the commission listened to survivors and others affected by Indian residential schools by way of statement gathering and other truth sharing processes. And what I think is so powerful about the process that the TRC used, like I said, they had no subpoena power, but in spite of that, they still had over 6,750 witnesses come forward. They recorded over 1,355 hours of audio and video recordings of survivors talking about their lived experiences and their stories with the Indian residential schools. There were 7 national events held across Canada. One of them was here in Halifax. And out of all of those pieces, the 6,750 statements from witnesses, the 1,300 plus hours of recordings, and all of these events came the 94 calls to action, which we're all very familiar with. So I just want to really briefly, I don't want to get in deep to the calls to action, but I do want to talk about how they were laid out. The first half of the calls were around redressing the legacy of Indian residential schools. And one of the things that I think is really important for us to recognize is how many of these are in the justice system itself. Almost 50% of the calls around redressing the legacy have to do with justice, right? So that's a very important thing to keep in mind when we look at the disproportionality that's happening in the justice system across Canada. In my bio earlier, it said that I used to work for Correctional Services Canada. So I absolutely did. I worked here in Nova Scotia at an institution, and I also worked in Saskatchewan at one. I worked in a healing lodge out there, and it says something about our society when we're actually building prisons for individual cultures, right? When I was in federal corrections, I was working in a female institution, a place called the Okamaochi Healing Lodge in southern Saskatchewan. And the healing lodges and the women's prisons across Canada, they all came about because of the actions of the guards at the prison for women in Kingston. So Kingston used to be the only federal prison for women across Canada. So if you were a federally sentenced woman from Nova Scotia, you couldn't serve your time in your home territory. You actually had to go to Kingston in order to serve your time. So back in the early 2000s, when I worked for federal corrections, there were approximately 300 women in federal custody across the country, and 75% of them were Indigenous. And when we get out to the prairies, that's the same number that's sort of floated around for Indigenous male prisoners as well, involved in the federal justice system out in the prairie region. So we've got this massive disproportionality that's happening within our justice system. So everything that's happening in the United States around the disproportionality with Black folks involved in the justice system, the exact same thing is happening here in Canada with Indigenous people. So there is that massive disproportionality. We talk about the disproportionality in health outcomes for Indigenous people, education. Only 1 in 3 Indigenous people across Canada actually graduate high school. That's a national travesty. And as well, as you can see on here, child welfare is listed number 1 to 5. And what actually scared me and many other Indigenous folks across Canada when the TRC released these 94 calls is, here we go again, same old, same old. The 94 calls that are in the calls to action are the exact same pieces that are in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the 464 recommendations that came out of that inquiry. And to date, not a single one of those 464 recommendations have actually been implemented. I say none of them, but I think there's about half of one. One of the calls was for a national holiday to celebrate Indigenous contribution to Canada. And we did get National Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st, but it isn't a national holiday. So, you know, when these 94 calls were coming out, it was the exact same thing. Here we go again. And then a couple days later, it was evident that thinking was absolutely on point, because the Supreme Court out in BC struck down the lawsuit that was happening around inequities in the child welfare system for Indigenous people. So they 1-5 before the ink was even dry were crossed right off this. Good news is there's been some movement forward since then, but the one thing that I really think we need to keep in mind is the language that we're using, and we're here around Canada. You know, we hear that the justice system's broken. We hear that the healthcare system's broken. We hear that the education system's broken. The child welfare system's broken. None of these systems are actually broken. They're working exactly how they were designed to work. Think about that from that supremacy ideology standpoint. These systems were built to elevate some and oppress others. So they're not broken. They're working exactly how they were designed to work. One last point on the child welfare piece. I think it's really important for all Canadians to know and understand that the child welfare system across Canada right now is Indian Residential School 2.0. Right now across the country, 52% of all children who are in care are Indigenous. So over 1 in 2 children that are in the foster care system across Canada are currently Indigenous. And if we look at the United Nations Declaration, or the United Nations Convention on Genocide, one of the definitions is the forcible removal of one child from one culture and forcibly placing them in another. That's exactly what's happening with the child welfare system right now. So we are in crisis mode right now because there are more Indigenous children in the welfare system in Canada that ever attended Indian residential schools at the height of the residential schools across our country. The second half of the calls are around advancing the process of Canadian reconciliation. So this is the area that looks at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It looks at the Royal Proclamations and the Covenant chain of treaties. You know, some of the pieces that we're hoping to talk about here today, or just sort of highlight around the equities or inequities in the legal system, training for public servants. We're talking about commemoration, media, business, and even newcomers to Canada. Youth programs is an extremely important one as well. So this is the area where there are a number of calls that folks can look at in society to actually advance the process of reconciliation, and not so much address the legacy of Indian residential schools, which were the first part of the calls. So when we think about that, what does that kind of mean for us as Canadians? We sort of get fixated on our work lives because we can sort of easily see that when it comes to the calls. So for example, you know, we're here talking right now, and call 27 is around training for the Federation of Law Societies across Canada. So that's sort of something that we're doing here today, right? Talking about Indian residential schools, the history, the legacy, and some of those pieces moving forward. But what about some of the other areas? When we look at some of the other calls, how can we see ourselves in our personal lives involved in those? So when we look at call number 7, for example, we call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Yes, that's pointing directly to the federal government, but what can we do as a society to look at those achievement gaps? The achievement gap is sort of a word that's been used quite a bit to talk about the discrepancies and disproportionality between success of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in the education system, in the employment system. I don't really refer to them as gaps anymore. I actually refer to them as achievement debts because they are a debt owed to those who have been harmed by the systems themselves. When we talk about the employment gaps, One of the things that I found so fascinating and disturbing is downtown Halifax right now. When you drive through downtown Halifax, there's 32 cranes in the air just on the peninsula itself. That's massive infrastructure that's happening. And we're hearing about shortages in the labor market all the time. You know, employers can't find anybody to hire. When I hear an employer say they can't find anybody to hire, what I think about and what I point out to them is what you're actually saying is you can't find anybody who looks like you to hire. You know, we have to be really honest about these conversations, right? And the proof is in the pudding. If you are a Mi'kmaq person, according to the 2016 census, if you are a Mi'kmaq person with a Red Seal certification in any trade in HRM, you still have a 20% unemployment rate. But yet industry is screaming and crying, saying that they can't find anybody to work. I actually call BS on that one, because we're here and we want to work. We're just not being hired and not being afforded the opportunities. The two fastest growing populations in Nova Scotia right now are Indigenous youth and African Nova Scotian youth. And those two groups face the highest unemployment rates, aside from persons with disabilities. That's an anomaly that's just completely out there. Right now across Canada, if you are a person with a disability, you have a 75% unemployment rate. So we still have a lot of work to do. So what does that mean for us as individuals? One of the things around the achievement gap is post-secondary education, right? If only one in three Indigenous people are graduating across Canada, where does that leave us? Here in Nova Scotia, it's a little bit different. We have a little bit of a different success when it comes to graduating Indigenous people from high school. And a lot of that has to do with the fact of the Mi'kmaq Education Act, the federal law, legislation, where Mi'kmaq communities are sort of in control of their own education. And because of that, we have the MK School Board, or Mi'kmaq School Board. And right now they have an 88% graduation rate. So they've been doing some amazing pieces. But when we think about the post-secondary education, what can we do as individuals? You know, once we're out there working and we're doing fairly well for ourselves, sometimes we like to give back to our schools, right? We make donations for bursaries and scholarships. So when we do that, why don't we take them and target them specifically for Indigenous students in order to start closing that achievement gap? Right? So we can do pieces like that. When it comes to youth programming, many of us, we take our spare time and we volunteer and we coach baseball, or we coach hockey, or we become leaders in 4-H, or scouts or Cubs or anything like that. And what normally happens is when we coach a baseball team or when we coach a hockey team, we end up coaching kids from our own communities that live by us, that look like us. So what are some opportunities, or can we look for opportunities if we want to coach an Indigenous team, to give up our time, to give up our skills and our expertise in order to work with Indigenous youth so that they have opportunities to succeed as well. So there's a number of different ways that we can actually do this. We just have to think outside of the box. The one thing that concerns me with the 94 calls to action, though, is a lot of organizations are treating them as a checkbox. And we know checkboxes do not change behavior. They do not change culture. So we have to think a little bit deeper. And it's actually quite interesting, because when I do these presentations with government officials, one of the things I always hear is, no, it's not a checkbox. It's about changing behaviors. It's about changing our organizations. And it's not true, because if it wasn't a checkbox, CBC would not treat it as one. If you Google CBC and calls to action, what you come up with is actually a checkbox. So I've got some numbers here. These numbers are a little bit older. They are actually from these are from 2022. So there's the checkbox that CBC actually puts out. It states that 20 of the calls are not started, 32 are in progress, which means projects have been proposed, 29 are in progress and projects are underway, and 13 are complete. So now if we fast forward a year and a half later to today, updated just yesterday, actually, the numbers look a little bit different. 18 are now not started, 31 projects have been proposed, 32 are underway, but unfortunately 13 are complete. So since 2015, since 2015, only 13 of the calls have actually been completed. If we keep up this pace, the 94 calls to action will not be completed until I think it's 2063. So we've got a lot of work to do. But if it's not a checkbox, why are we treating it as one, as you can see right here? So once the call is complete, we never have to look at it again. One of the things that I really encourage folks to do, instead of just focusing on the 94 calls to action, I think it's extremely important to focus on the 10 principles to reconciliation. And I'm actually going to read those to you because I think it's extremely important to hear the words of these 10 principles and understand that these are actually the building blocks or the foundation to the 94 calls themselves. And if we focus on the 10 principles to reconciliation, that's where we can actually start to change culture and change behaviors and change this relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People provides the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of Canadian society. First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people as the original peoples of this country and as self-determining peoples have treaty, constitutional, and human rights that must be recognized and respected. Reconciliation is a process of healing of relationships that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledges and redresses past harms. Reconciliation requires constructive action on addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on Indigenous people's education, cultures and languages, health, child welfare, the administration of justice, and economic opportunities and prosperities. Reconciliation must create a more equitable and inclusive society by closing the gaps in social, health, and economic outcomes that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. All Canadians as treaty people share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. The perspectives and understandings of Indigenous elders and traditional knowledge keepers about the ethics, concepts, and practices of reconciliation are vital to long-term reconciliation. Supporting Indigenous people's cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land into the reconciliation process are essential. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as a substantial investment of resources. And finally, reconciliation requires a sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, and Indigenous rights, as well as the historical and contemporary contributions of Indigenous people to Canadian society. I just want to talk very briefly about one of these pieces around revitalization. One of the things that we see in social media quite a bit, and it's sort of becoming a talking point again over the last several months, is around revitalization and cultural revitalization. You know, I hear comments from folks, why should my taxpayers' dollars go to support Indigenous people regaining their culture? You know, and I hear that quite often. There's a couple pieces to that I think we really have to understand. First and foremost, we didn't give our culture up. This is something that was not just stolen from us, but it was beaten from us. Okay, it was absolutely beaten from us. I've talked to a number of survivors of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, and I remember hearing one story one time. An elder shared with me about a young girl who was at the Shubenacadie school, and she was 5 years old at the time. When she got to the school, she didn't speak any English. She only spoke Mi'kmaq. It was her first language. It was her only language. And one of the things we got to remember is a lot of these children were actually forcibly removed from their homes under threat of imprisonment, under threat of starvation, under threat of violence by the legal system. So this young girl was taken to the school, and she was quite upset. You know, she could only speak one language. She didn't know the language that was being spoken there, and she cried a lot, and she kept wanting her parents. And she was speaking Mi'kmaq, and as a form of punishment, the workers actually went up to her and they grabbed her tongue and they pulled it out and they stuck a needle through it. This was a 5-year-old girl. Another girl was working in the laundry room, because we got to remember, these were not education systems. They were actually schools that were built to kill the Indian and save the child, assimilate Indigenous people, and create a labor force for Canadian expansion, for general labor. So the boys would learn basic carpentry skills and how to work the fields, and the girls would learn how to do domestic chores, cooking and cleaning. And up in Shubenacadie, they had a large laundry room, and they had these 2 big industrial rollers for the sheets. So the wet sheets would be fed through these rollers, and what would happen is the rollers would dry them and press them at the same time. And a young girl that was working the machinery, her arm got sucked into the machine. And all of the other young girls that were working in the laundry room were screaming and trying to turn the machine off, but they couldn't reach the switch because those machines are built for adults to use. They eventually managed to get it turned off, and she was pulled out of the machine and she lost her arm. She was sent to the hospital, and a few days later, after she started to recover, she was actually brought back to the Indian residential school to continue on there. So when we talk about cultural revitalization, I think it's really important for us to understand that this isn't something we gave up. It's not something we wanted to give up. It was something that was forced from us. It was stolen from us. So we need to bring it back. You know, we're living in the day and age of DNA testing. So, you know, you can pay $89 to ancestry.ca. They send you a little tube, you spit in it, it's mailed away. And about 2 months later, you get an email. And you could open up your email and check, and then all of a sudden your DNA says that you're 25% Irish and you're 50% Scottish and 25% Italian, for example. So now you've got an opportunity. You can go to Ireland to learn about that history. You can go to Scotland to trace your ancestry, to learn about the culture. You can go to Italy to learn about the culture there. For Indigenous people, where do we go? We've got absolutely nowhere else to go. We come to your backyards. So if that culture dies, that is a whole generation, and future generations that won't know who they are, will not know where they come from. So we need to continue to revitalize Indigenous cultures, because this is something that was actually forcibly stolen from us by the Canadian government and Canadian policies. It's not something we rightfully gave up. So when we talk about revitalization, that's what we're talking about. And we also have to understand that it's not taxpayers' dollars that are actually going towards this. What it is the money that was put aside for the Indian Trust several years ago that the Canadian government used. They appropriated and actually used that to fund the war effort. So the money that is going into the Department of Indian Affairs, first of all, 75% of that stays in the bureaucracy, and the rest of it that comes out, it goes to community for infrastructure, it goes for policing, it goes for health, it goes for education, it goes for cultural revitalization. But the money that goes to that entire department does not even pay the compounded interest on the money that was actually taken out of this trust that was put aside for Indigenous people. So when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we need to acknowledge the history of our relationship to date. We need to take responsibility for our role in what has happened. We have to take action to move from a relationship. And this is extremely important, because I think this speaks to that idea of reconciliation. You know, a relationship was good, something happened and we tried to mend it. We know that wasn't the case. So we have to take action to move from a relationship of violence and separation to one of mutual respect and dialogue. Because up until today, our relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada has been one of violence and separation. We are still seeing that today when we think about the violence that's happening on the wharfs across Nova Scotia. Mi'kmaq people were fisher people. We were for 13,000 years. And then all of a sudden we were pushed out of not our livelihood, but our survival. We were fisher people. 70% of our diet was protein based, and 75% of that came from fish. So we're talking about a society that has been for 13,000 years fishing, and then all of a sudden not allowed into the fisheries. And we think about the violence that's happening when we try to exercise our treaty and inherent rights, and that violence that happens between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And this whole idea around separation, we had children that were forcibly taken from our homes. They're still being taken from our homes today on even larger numbers. So we have to try to find a way to move forward. So what I've done is I've taken the 94 calls and I've divided them up into 4 key pillars around cultural allyship, humility, reflection, and respect. So when we think about cultural allyship, this is where we actually stand with Indigenous people rather than just know about them. We have to build safety, talking about building safety within our institutions, within our organizations, so that Indigenous people can be their full selves when they come to these institutions, to these organizations. We have to talk about building safety within our spaces and places within society. It is still extremely dangerous for an Indigenous hockey team to play anywhere in Nova Scotia. Because of the name calling that happens, the violence that happens. It's a continual basis around our province. We have to look at Indigenous epistemologies around relationality and the interconnectedness between the sacred and secular. This whole idea of holism, right? The whole picture, the whole person. And we have to think in that holistic way, because when we think of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, everything within that picture is actually connected and it can't be separated itself. So we need to think of, the personal and holistic experiential learning, this place-based piece, the intergenerational learning that happens, the passing down of knowledge from elders to youth. And remember that our entire learning journey is more than just learning. It's about a learning spirit, or the learning journey that happens from the time we're born until the time we leave this earth. There's no way to separate yourself from it. We have to recognize the role of ceremony and how important that is. What does that mean for folks in the in the justice system? If you are bringing in working with a victim, are you provided an opportunity in a safe place where you're meeting with them so that they can smudge, for example? What are we doing to make sure that ceremony is being upheld, that it can be practiced in Western society? We have to look at the intergenerational legacy of the Indian residential school system. Right now, we're in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th generation of survivors from those schools. I was talking about Nora Bernard earlier, being a survivor and a victim of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. She was absolutely both. She did survive the school only to be killed by her grandson, who broke into her house looking for money and drugs. So that in itself speaks to that intergenerational piece when it comes to victims of Indian residential schools. My family itself, I don't speak the language. My mother doesn't speak the language. My grandparents don't speak the language. My grandparents were never taught the language by their parents. And the reason being is to keep them safe, to keep them out of the Indian residential school. My great-grandfather attended the Shubenacadie Indian Day School for one day. He was there one day, and that day he was there, he was beaten by the nuns. So he ran away and never went back. So he didn't want any of his children or his family to suffer through any of that. So what he did was he refused to teach them the language. He refused to teach them the culture or call it the culture. And he moved them to a very rural part of Nova Scotia where there were no other Indigenous people. And that's where my family has been located ever since, right? So none of my family, my immediate family attended the Indian residential school in Shubenacadie, but because of the direct results of the Indian Day School in Shubenacadie, we've all suffered the same loss when it comes to culture and identity and language. And we also have to look at the deconstruction of cultural assumptions of mainstream institutions. Western society has a huge fixation on time and time management. And that's one of the ones that I always like to use for an example. For many Indigenous folks, things start once we're all ready to be there. And time isn't as important. I think of a former colleague of mine, and would have been a colleague of everybody else's, Candy Palmer, former lawyer. And I remember talking to her one day, and she was telling me about a Mi'kmaq person that was coming from Cape Breton into Halifax for a job interview, and they never showed up. And so the interview never happened. So she ended up calling them later to ask, what happened. And as they were on their way to Halifax, they hit a deer. And at that time, what was most important was not just the life of that deer, but the value of that deer that gave up its life for folks. So that deer was picked up, it was brought back home, butchered, so that could be shared amongst the family and community. Because at that time, that's what was most important. So we have to look at these cultural assumptions that organizations and Western society has about Indigenous people, and find a way to work together around that. The next pillar was around humility and understanding that your way is not always the right way. And for a lot of folks, that's sometimes hard to hear. We grow up with a certain amount of knowledge and a certain way of doing and a certain way of being, and anything outside of that is generally seen as abnormal. And we have to understand that ways of knowing other than your own are not less valid. And we have to address traditional knowledge with the respect it deserves and in a spirit of genuine learning and collaboration. When I think about knowledge and time, one of the things I really like to think about is fireflies in our territory. When fireflies first appear, and they don't flash, they just sort of appear. They're stuck on your screens, they're stuck on your walls. But when those fireflies first make their appearance, that was a signaler of time for the Mi'kmaq people to actually go into the woods and start to harvest birch bark, because the water was actually being sucked up on the inner layers of that bark at that specific time. And when it was peeled off, it came off in larger, thicker pieces. And that could be used for transportation, for building canoes, for building shelters and stuff like that. And then a few weeks later, once fireflies start mating, they start flashing their bums as they're flying around in the woods. That was a signal that it was time to go back into the woods to harvest birch bark once again. But this time it comes off in really fine pieces, because all of the water is going up through all different areas of the bark, so it comes off in finer pieces. So that's an important piece of knowledge, and it's not less valid than the knowledge that we have around the changing of the seasons in Western knowledge. The hard part for many of us to look at is this reflection idea, and how did we actually get here? Because this is the area where we have to do the hard internal work. I think about it like cultural competency, cultural proficiency, or cultural humility, whichever one's being used today. It's that inside out approach. It's about how we relate to others as opposed to how others relate to us. And it forces us to do the hard work so that the work gets done. So this is where we have to do that internal questioning. What is my role in colonization? We all have a role to play. Me as an Indigenous person, as a Mi'kmaq person, is still playing a role in colonization in all of my previous jobs. I worked for the RCMP, an organization that was built and founded on the actual destruction of Indigenous people. I worked in federal corrections, an organization who is disproportionately locking up Indigenous people. And when they come in as a minimum security prisoner, finding ways to elevate their risk level so that they're maxed out, so that they can be put out of sight, out of mind. So we all have these roles in colonization. So we have to really take a deep look at that. We have to start asking ourselves, how have I benefited personally from a system that has been built to lift some and hold others back? We have to take a deep look and understand this whole falsehood of meritocracy. How, this idea that you get to where you are in life by the amount of hard work you put in, that's absolutely fine. And on paper and in theory, it makes absolute sense. But when you take that and you lay it on top of a system that is built upon systemic oppression and white supremacy, it doesn't work. I always think about my time working up in the Valley, and you know, so you think about this, little Johnny's at school, and we're telling him that he can be whatever he wants to be based on the amount of hard work that he puts in. There's absolutely nothing wrong with telling a child that. Don't get me wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with telling them that. But then we have to think about the related unconscious bias that is instilling in somebody. So little Johnny's walking home, and he walks by a farm, and he sees migrant workers in the field bent over picking food. So the first thing that goes through little Johnny's mind through an unconscious bias perspective is, I must be better than them because look where my family's at and look where they're at. So there is a lot of harm in this whole ideology of meritocracy, and we have to completely remove that from our language because it's something that doesn't work and it just doesn't make sense. We have to commit to occasional unlearning and be comfortable with not knowing, and that is extremely difficult for many of us, myself included. I'm not going to deny that. I like to know everything, and being uncomfortable and sitting in not knowing is absolutely okay. And we have to get to a place where we can actually recognize and understand that and respect it. Another piece that's really important to understand is, you know, on how did we get here, is this whole idea around rigidity and perspective. It actually limits rather than illuminate. So when we surround ourselves with like-minded folks, we get into a groupthink mentality, and there's no chance for innovation. The only way we can have innovation is through diversity of thought. So when we're rigid in our perspectives, there's absolutely no way that we can actually move forward. And we have to understand what's been created at the hands of colonial structures within Indigenous communities. And when I think about that, I think about lateral violence and internalized racism that happens within our communities. How, you know, the way many Indigenous communities are thinking about this right now, and we think about it through these colonial structures. Think about the Indian Act itself, and when Bill C-31 was passed. So prior to Bill C-31, under the Indian Act, when an Indigenous man married a non-Indigenous woman, she automatically became Indigenous. And when an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she absolutely completely lost her identity. So after Bill C-31, when these women who lost their identity because of marriage, because they married a non-Indigenous man, they lost their status, they could apply to get it back. And so they were coming back into community. However, funding and all those sort of pieces weren't increasing with this increase in population with these women who were coming back into the community and bringing children. After the passing of Bill C-31, Indigenous populations in community increased by 25%. Without any increase in funding to support housing, to support healthcare, to support education, to support police protection, any of these things, none of it increased. So what that did was it actually set up a system of classism within our communities that never existed before. My mother was a victim of Bill C-31. When she got married, she lost her status. I didn't, because I was born before she got married. So my mother applied to get her status back, and to this day in our community, she's still referred to as a Bill C-31. So it set up this whole idea of class and that lateral violence and internalized racism that goes along with it. This feeling of inferiority, you know, that we've been told that we're no good for so long, you start to believe that and you internalize it, as well as our replacement of traditional leadership with colonial-based systems. Within our communities, our elections happen every 2 years, and that's based under the Indian Act. And that's an intentional piece that's put in the Act to prevent Indigenous communities from actually organizing and creating economic spinoff and benefits within their communities. If you have a government that's so volatile that it's going to change, that could possibly change every 2 years, no businesses will negotiate with you. So it's intentionally done that way to prevent us from getting economic benefits through capacity building within our communities. And this every 2-year piece also sets up a field of corruption. You get elected, you spend 6 months building a team, you do about 6 months work, and then you're back on the election trail again. So this leads to nepotism, and it leads to vote buying, basically. I remember an election one year in our community, somebody came around my door giving me Tim Hortons cards, buying votes. And that is intentionally set up under the Indian Act to prevent our leadership from actually doing good within many of our communities. Finally, the last piece is around respect, and we have to acknowledge and celebrate the difference that difference makes for individuals, for communities, for resilient cultures. We also have to respect, understand, and acknowledge what has been lost at the hands of these colonial structures as well. Our knowledge systems, our language, our wisdom, our societal structures, and even our gender roles within Indigenous communities. All of these under colonial rule have been diminished or almost completely wiped out. So what actually happened was a lot of these were sent underground by our elders to hold them. And they're starting to come back, because what's happening is we're getting young, educated, well-off Indigenous people that are working in different fields like law, like education, for the government. But we're noticing that something is missing, right? Because we're spending all of our time in these colonial structures, and there's a pulling and a feeling that part of the self is missing. So it's the young generations that are going back to community, going back to elders and asking for this back, because we know it's a safe time to bring these back now. Our knowledge, our language, like I said, the wisdom, and this whole idea around gender roles. This binary system of gender and gender identity is a Western colonial introduced piece to many Indigenous communities. For the longest time, we had multiple ways of gender and gender expression. The binary system never really existed. So there's even a push for that to start coming back within our communities. So, and just a couple more pieces here, and I'm hoping I have enough time to show this video, but I do know you want to do some question and answer, so I might just put the video in the chat for folks to watch later. I just want you to remember that the 10 principles of reconciliation are extremely important to actually change the discourse, to change the conversation, to change culture and behavior within society. And remember that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is that foundational piece for everything else. Indigenous people are self-determining people. This whole idea around reconciliation is going to take a lot of healing, both with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, because we've all suffered. Whether you're Indigenous or not, we've all been victims of this colonial piece, whether we recognize it or not. It's going to create it's going to need sustained action in order to move this forward. We can't just do these one-offs and that's it. We have to continually build and move forward. Nothing about us without us. We have to be included in all the conversations that are happening. And this is the responsibility of all Canadians. It's not an Indigenous issue. It's a Canadian issue. And that's one of the things that I'm finding actually this week. I noticed a letter. My daughter is an Indigenous support worker in a school board, and there was a request that came out from their board office asking all the Indigenous support workers what they're planning on doing for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, because global TV, global news had contacted them and want to know what's going on. So they're asking the Indigenous support workers. So my question is, why aren't they asking the administrators of those schools? If reconciliation is not an Indigenous issue, it's a Canadian issue. So what ends up happening during these times, whether it's Treaty Day, Mi'kmaq History Month, September 30th, and it's very similar for the African Nova Scotian community in February as well, with African Heritage Month, is we're the ones that are doing all the hard work, and we're doing that work for others. It's a Canadian issue. We need to have everybody stepping up in order to move this dialogue further. It's all of our history. It's our shared history. The last quote I just want to finish off with was with Murray Sinclair as well. And I think this is extremely important for everybody to recognize and remember that while Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathens, savages, pagans, and inferior people, that exact same message was being delivered in the public school systems across this country. So those pieces that we were being told, other children were being told the exact same thing. So just remember that this whole idea around reconciliation is around creating a new vision of a shared future for all of us here, not just in Nova Scotia, but all across Canada. And the fact that we're all treaty people and we're all treaty beneficiaries means that we all have a role to play in creating a relationship that's based on mutual respect and not on violence and separation. I'm going to skip the video because we've only got about 10 minutes left. And I just want to finish off by asking you all to think closely about reconciliation itself and your commitments. And remember, reconciliation is actually a verb. It's not a noun. It's a thing that we do. It's a doing piece. So I want you to think about what your own personal. So think about yourself personally. Think about yourself in your professional capacity, and think about yourself in your social capacity. What are your short-term goals to help move reconciliation forward? What can you do as a medium-term goal and a long-term goal? In the end, once you're up there and you're retired, I've got about 10 years left. I can't wait. But once you start looking back on your life, what have you done to help build and foster a better relationship in Canada between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people? I want you to think about that and reflect on that, and maybe there's an opportunity for you all to start sharing some of those short-term goals, those medium-term goals, and looking at what you would like to see as a future society here in Canada, where all Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people can get together hand in hand and move forward collectively, like our treaties said we should be doing. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we've probably got about 10 minutes left, I think, if there are any questions. There we go. I think I got it. Is it gone?
It is. Thank you so much, Jude.
Okay,
That
perfect.
was
Yeah.
so much information. Thank you so much. I started this by saying, for me, reconciliation is, as Sherry had communicated, it starts with learning. And thank you so much for creating this opportunity for us to learn. There was a question, I think, Sherry, a different Sherry has her hand up. So go ahead, Sherry.
Hi, Jude. Hi, everybody on this call. This was a fantastic presentation. I'm not a great speaker, so I'll try and get through this.
Sure.
I just wanted to pass along that my son is working at Neptune, and they are putting on the show Powhatan. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. It's Macbeth. And
yes.
Anyway, I just wanted to say that they are doing it, and they're actually taking the show to Yellowknife, and he has the opportunity that he is going to go to Yellowknife to do this production with them. So we're very, very proud of that. And I just, again, wanted to pass along that it's playing from October 3rd to the 8th on the Scotiabank stage. And that they do the smudging first thing in the morning and when they're done in the afternoon. So this is the real culture thing for him, that of course he's never been involved in anything like that. So anyway, I just wanted to pass that along for anybody in the Halifax area that may, want to take it in. I know there are a few Neptune goers, but I didn't know if people knew about it. So
I absolutely appreciate you sharing that. It's actually kind of timely, because my daughter shared that with me last night as well, because she's looking at taking a number of her students from her middle school to see it. That's absolutely fabulous. If anybody is around Halifax, I highly encourage you to take that show, and it looks like it's going to be wonderful. Thank you very much for that.
Alexandria Hewitt again. I regret that I don't know about this show. So what's the context here? Is it in Mi'kmaq, or is it all Mi'kmaq or Indigenous actors, or
Yeah,
how's?
it's a little bit of everything. There is some Mi'kmaq in it. It's Indigenous and non-Indigenous actors, and I believe, Sherry, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's actually is being supported in conjunction with the Friendship Center. Is it not?
Unfortunately, Jude, I don't know, but I know it's Prismatic Arts Festival, the Prismatic.
Yes,
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly as
you are.
well.
Yep.
But
Yep.
I dumped the link in the chat for anybody who kind of wants to look more
Awesome.
into it or what have you, right? But yeah, no, I don't know if I can see it, unfortunately, only because I got a really busy time frame going on with the short amount of time that it is playing, but I'm sure it's going to be fantastic, right? And
That's
I hope
awesome.
anybody
Absolutely.
goes who's interested in it. Yeah. But thanks again. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Sherry. I think it's a great example too of, that cultural allyship that you were talking about, Jude, and creating,
Absolutely.
that safe space for people who are Indigenous to learn about, embrace, and revisit their culture and own it and celebrate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed in the chat around 12 hours of volunteer hours a year. Absolutely, there are some great opportunities that you can use those volunteer hours. I just think about what recently happened here in Halifax. The North American Indigenous Games was a huge success, aside from the massive rain and flooding the final day. But volunteer hours for anything like that, absolutely. There's events that happen all through October with Mi'kmaq History Month, Treaty Day celebrations, volunteer to work in local community food banks. There are so many things that you can do with those 12 hours that would be hugely appreciative with community. And if you are in Halifax, or any other city areas where there is a friendship center, absolutely reach out to the friendship center and see if there's anything you could do to volunteer with them, whether it's preparing meals for folks, whether it's trips, anything like that. There's amazing things that you can actually do.
Jude, if you don't mind a personal question, you
Absolutely.
indicated that your father is not Indigenous,
Correct.
and that you don't speak your mom's mother tongue. How do you bridge that gap, I suppose, to feeling like you're part of your community and belong when you don't speak the Indigenous language? You obviously had, white man's influence in your upbringing. Your father wasn't Indigenous, and some of the challenge that you experience as a result of that. I've heard people say, I'm watching news stories and whatnot. Well, they don't look Indigenous, right? And that whole notion that you don't belong to either.
Yo, listen, that's the story of my life. The first thing I'll say to that is actually what you just said there at the end. People are watching news stories and they say, well, they don't look Indigenous. When we think back to some of the words that Donald Trump said a few years ago, it's exactly the exact same thing. But it's the one thing I would say around that is the litmus test does not work. One of the worst things you can do, walk into an organization and just do a visual of who the minorities are within an organization, right? Because we know that the litmus test doesn't work. One of the things that we have to remember is that here in Nova Scotia, we've been dealing with colonialism for 500 years. Out west, they've been dealing with it for 100 years. So there's a huge difference within that. And I remember I had some friends out in Saskatchewan. Their son actually came down here to Cape Breton, actually, and he was on a show called Merchants of the Wild. It's a show on APTN where they take Indigenous youth and they put them basically back in the bush to learn from elders, to learn about history, to learn about survival, to learn about indigeneity, but it's done in different geographical areas across Canada. So he was Cree from Saskatchewan, and he was here in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton while this show was being filmed. And the one thing he told his mother when he got back home was, I can't believe how fair-skinned the Indigenous people are in Nova Scotia. So there is that huge difference. So for me, I really don't think of it like that because I look like everybody else in my community. And when it comes to language, I'm very upset that I don't have my language. It is one of those things that when I go to a job interview and it says that Mi'kmaq language is an asset or a requirement for a job, I sit there and I think about how actually discriminatory that is for a Mi'kmaq person, because I don't have my language because government policies took it from me. So instead of saying that, Mi'kmaq language is an asset, that could be, are you willing to learn Mi'kmaq to set it up better? Because there are very few people in mainland Nova Scotia that speak the language anymore. I think about a community like Annapolis Valley First Nation. I think there's maybe 2 people that speak the language. In my community in Millbrook, there are more, but not many more. So there are very few people on mainland Nova Scotia that actually speak the language. That's why I think it's so important for us to work on language revitalization so that we all do have an opportunity to learn it. But as for growing up between 2 different worlds, I think that's one of the things that that all people who are biracial or bicultural have to be at minimum bicultural, because we have to learn how to navigate both worlds. We have to learn to navigate the Western world, and we have to learn to navigate the Indigenous world. So I always think, and it's kind of hard to do here on Teams, but what I always do is a demonstration of me walking forward, and my left foot always remains in the white world, and my right foot always remains in the Indigenous world. And what happens when those 2 cross? When I cross them over, I trip and I fall over. So we really have to learn to navigate both worlds. I've been very fortunate myself because, yes, my father was not Indigenous, but I was brought up in my community. I was brought up in a community that didn't say that these were Mi'kmaq teachings. They were just teachings. And they weren't called Mi'kmaq teachings because that had been beat into us so much to keep us safe that we still passed down culture, but we didn't call it culture being passed down, which actually gets me to exactly where I'm at today, because I'm currently writing my master's thesis around that point exactly. It's around revitalizing Indigenous leadership in an educational context. And I'm doing my thesis through storytelling. So I'm relating all of these pieces that I learn about Indigenous traditional leadership and tying them back into the stories and the teachings that my grandfather gave me as I was growing up. So that I can sort of relate those 2 pieces together, and it gives me more of a sense of identity of who I am. I don't know if that answers your question, but try my best.
That was lovely. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. And I will also read out a comment that was placed in the chat from Renee, also in Newfoundland with Sherry, who says, it reminds me of a phrase I often hear, that only in Newfoundland will you find a redheaded Indigenous person, which I think feeds up to a question a little bit earlier in the chat from Audrey, who is a newcomer to Canada from Ireland. And she said, I find so many similarities between Canadian and Irish histories in relation to colonialization and struggles relating to industrial and residential schools, diminishing the Irish language, etc. So I feel this presentation very close to my heart. My question is there anything I can do as a newcomer to better educate myself or make myself available to help in any way going forward? And I would say that this is a question we should all hold, but thank you for asking it as a newcomer, Audrey.
Oh, Audrey, I greatly appreciate that. The similarities are absolutely amazing. When I sit back and I think about some of the things that we've had to endure here in our territory, one of the ones that comes to mind very much, and I know it's not Irish, but it's more Scottish, is Edward Cornwallis and the Scalping Proclamations. What a lot of folks don't realize and recognize is that the scalping thing wasn't our way. This was something that was introduced by Cornwallis, and he actually honed his skills in the Highlands of Scotland before coming here and passing that on to us through scalping proclamations. So it is a long shared story of countries and cultures that have been impacted through colonialism. Colonialism just isn't a North American thing; it's a worldwide thing. That has impacted so many cultures across the globe. So I get exactly what you're saying, because I see those relations and those connections as well. But as to what you can do, I just to continue to educate. I shared some resources with Angela. Angela, if you don't mind, if you can share some of those out, that would be fabulous. But just learn, just educate yourself. The crazy thing is, for some of the stuff that I'm talking about, I had to educate myself on it as well, so others can do it too. And as far as learning more, just take part in things that are happening around our communities. In the summertime, we have what's called the Powwow Trail. It's our community celebrations that are open to everybody, and there's one in a different community every couple of weeks across the province. It's a time for us to celebrate our identity, celebrate our culture, celebrate our history, but also share and celebrate our history with non-Indigenous people. So these events are open to everybody whenever they're happening in a community on a weekend. They're family-based events. There's absolutely no drugs or alcohol tolerated at any of these events. And it's just a place where everybody can learn and everybody can come and celebrate together. I do know on Treaty Day this year, historically on Treaty Day, there's always been a massive celebration here in Halifax, which included a huge feast, a gala, and all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, funding has been cut, so it's not all happening. But I do know that the Friendship Center, I believe up on the Halifax Commons, is going to be doing some events for Treaty Day, which is Sunday. So I don't know if they're doing it Sunday or Monday. But one of the things that they've always done up on the Commons is they actually do a traditional feast using plank salmon that they give out. I think they've got meals for about 400 people. Whoever show up. So there's events that happen all over the place, not just in Halifax, but all over Nova Scotia and all over Atlantic Canada. So if you just keep an ear to the ground, keep an eye on social media, and or check out the Mi'kmaq Maliseet News, because that always posts events that are happening, and just go and enjoy yourself and learn.
Thank you so much, Jude. I think we're down to the last minute. Was there another comment or question? Okay, thank you so much. And I will try to find information. I think we actually got a notice about that event for those of us in Nova Scotia. Of course, we do have others who are in other locations, but I think Engage Nova Scotia was promoting the Friendship Center events happening on Treaty Day. So I'll look for that email.
Awesome.
Okay, and I want to just sort of reiterate your comment about setting our goals, sort of reflecting and setting short-term, medium, and long-term goals about how we can, really commit to ReconciliAction. And I'll share one thing is, when I reflect back on my past, I grew up in Newfoundland, but I grew up in St. John's, and I regret that I didn't even have awareness about the Indigenous communities on the island region of Newfoundland. Like, it's so shameful. Of course, I knew about the communities in Labrador, but really didn't realize that there was even a population. And I lived on the West Coast when I was little. And so when I moved to Northern Ontario, it was really my first exposure to Indigenous populations. And the racism that I observed was so deep and so like hurtful. And I reacted sort of viscerally to it, but I didn't have the knowledge or the language to be an ally. And I regret that. And so I guess what my short-term goal or my long-term goal is to just really build my toolkit so that if ever I'm in a situation, that I can be a vocal ally for people of Indigenous descent.
I appreciate that greatly, because we need allies. You know, the whole point around allyship is elevating voices of those whose voices aren't heard, and using your privilege to do so. So I greatly appreciate that. Before I go, I just want to make one last comment that I think is extremely important. So Renee, you put in here, it reminds me of our phrase I often heard, that only in Newfoundland will you find a redheaded Indigenous person. Absolutely. That is one of those things that I think is important for me to share before we go. And I know we are at a time, so I do apologize, but hey, it's my time, so I'm taking it. When I moved out to Saskatchewan several years ago, I had 3 young daughters with me. And my 3 daughters, if you got to know them, they are all blonde hair, blue eyed. And you know, we're still trying to figure that out, because here I am, Mi'kmaq, my family's been here for 13,000 years. My wife is a first generation immigrant from Italy. So where we got 3 blonde haired, blue eyed children from, we still don't know. But when we moved out to Saskatchewan, I moved out to rural southern Saskatchewan. And that was my first time in my life that I feared for my children's safety. And I actually told my 3 children, please do not tell anybody you're Indigenous. It's something that I look back on, and it makes me sick to my stomach to say that and to think about it. But that is the reality of what I had to do to protect my children when we moved out west. So I get it completely. You know, even for me growing up here in Nova Scotia, you know, I grew up I lived in Cole Harbour. So living in Cole Harbour and going to school out in Cherrybrook, you know, so here I am, an Indigenous kid living in a middle-class white community, going to school in the largest Black community per capita in North America. And the only place that I felt that I could let folks know my identity and who I was not in Cole Harbour. It wasn't in Forest Hills. It was out in Cherrybrook, because there was a sense of safety being amongst another group that had similar experiences to what my family has endured growing up. So I just want to say thank you all very much, Walalio. I appreciate you taking the time and inviting me to come in to speak to you today. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and take an opportunity this weekend to learn, to read. APTN is going to be showing a number of documentaries and series that I encourage everybody, if you get an opportunity, to watch over the weekend. Walalio, thank you all very much, and have a safe weekend.
Thank you, Jude. We're so grateful, and the same to you. Take care.